Okay, here we are, me again. This time we are going to, still in Unit 3, talking about how drugs pass membranes to reach their targets. So remember that anytime we're administering a drug, unless the action is right where you put it, which is a local action, if the action is anywhere other than where you put it, it has to get to that place. So that's what we're talking about here. So here are the big factors which influence the rate of drugs passing through the membranes. I'm going to introduce them quickly and then we'll talk about them independently. So here in this picture that you can see, here's our cell, the inside of the cell. This is the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, as you know. So the big things that are going to affect how effectively a drug is going to be able to get to its target is whether or not it can get across a membrane, right? If the target is any place other than where you put it, even in the case that when it's where you put it, it's got to get to the receptor, which means it's going to have to traverse a few membranes. In some cases, many membranes, in other cases, not as many, but it's still got to get out of one place and into another, which means it's got to cross some membranes. So variable number 1 is size and shape. Things that are big and weird shaped tend to be repelled by membranes. Things that are small can usually get right across through a pore or something or some sort of channel. Then we have whether it's lipid soluble, right? Things that are fat soluble are able to diffuse right through a cell membrane. Things that are not fat soluble, that are water soluble or hydrophilic and lipophobic, those would be repelled. So something that's hydrophobic and lipophilic, which is fat soluble, goes right in. And then there's the degree of ionization. And the degree of ionization and the pH of the surrounding medium go together. Drugs that are ionized or charged tend to be repelled by the cell membrane. Charged particles tend not to absorb, not to pass across the cell membrane easily. Things that are non-ionized and non-charged will go right across. The pH of the surrounding medium is what will determine whether or not a drug is going to ionize. So those go together. All right, so let's talk about them independently. Here's a picture of a cell membrane. You guys know all about this. You know that the cell membrane is pretty elaborate. There's all kinds of structures embedded and attached to the cell membrane. There's, chains, glycoprotein chains, glycolipid chains. These are a lot of times used for recognition. Then we've got our membrane-bound receptors. Here's some cholesterol in there, which help to keep our membrane fluid. Whoops. So again, in terms of the membrane part of this, the membrane regulates what gets into a cell or comes out of a cell. And so whether it's lipid soluble makes a difference. Things that are lipid soluble go right through. Water soluble things, unless they're very small and uncharged, they can go through a little pore or a channel. But if they're big and shaped weird and charged, they're not going to get through. And then, of course, we have all kinds of membrane complexes that help to facilitate carrier-mediated transport, which you learned about a lot in physiology. Okay, so that's the membrane structure. Size and shape, lipid solubility. So here's a little bit more on lipid solubility. In order for a drug to directly penetrate a membrane, it's got to be lipid soluble. Anything that's lipophilic, that's the word for lipid solubility. Lipophilic, hydrophobic, those sorts of compounds go right through. Drugs are no different. Okay, so let's talk about this degree of ionization for a bit. So this is all about charge, right? So the degree of ionization is definitely going to be influenced by the pH of the surrounding area. And the general rule of thumb, and you could get as complex with this as you wanted to, which I don't want to. And you don't need to for this particular course. But what we want to remember is that certain drugs are going to be ionized at different pHs. So, for example, an acidic drug, and a good example of an acidic drug would be a barbiturate. An acidic drug tends to be less ionized in a low pH, so in an environment like the drug. When the environment is like the drug, the pH of the surrounding area environment is the same as the pH of the drug tends to not ionize, in which case it will be more readily absorbed. A drug in an unlike environment, so an acidic drug in an alkaline environment, is going to be more likely to ionize, which would decrease its absorption. A basic drug like morphine, basic drugs tend to not ionize in a, what do you think, acidic or basic? Where would they be less likely to ionize? Hopefully you're saying in an alkaline environment, in an environment like the drug. So a basic drug is less likely to ionize in a basic environment. A basic drug is more likely to ionize in an acidic environment. Right, and of course, I'm sure you guys remember this, but an acidic environment has a low pH and a basic environment has a high pH. All right, so a good place we can kind of play with this is the stomach and the small intestine, because the stomach, as we know, is a very weird place in the body, the only place in the body where you're going to find any fluid that's got a pH of 1 or 2. Whereas the small intestine, because of the secretion of bicarbonate from the pancreas, the small intestine tends to be more on the alkaline side of things. Whoa. So how this relates to absorption: non-ionized drugs tend to not be charged. Remember, ionization basically means to break apart and break something down into its ionic components. And ionic components, by definition, are charged. So a non-ionized drug is more likely to be absorbed. So this is aspirin in an acidic environment, and there's very few drugs that get absorbed in the stomach. Aspirin is one of them. Alcohol is another thing that gets absorbed in the stomach. The stomach is acidic. So aspirin, salicylic acid, in hydrochloric acid tends to not ionize, and therefore the aspirin gets absorbed. Aspirin in an alkaline environment, like in the small intestine, tends to ionize, and therefore it does not get transported across this membrane. It gets trapped in the small intestine. Does that make sense to you guys? So when we use the word trapped, that means it's going to stay wherever it is when it ionizes. And that's kind of the key to this. Sometimes you might have to press pause and think about this for just 1 second. Because if you stop to think about it, it will hopefully start to make sense to you. We start talking about chemistry and everyone panics. All right, so let's look here. Again, this is just another sort of way to look at it. This is looking at something ionizing, right? So hydrochloric acid is made up of hydrogen ions and chloride ions, and when they ionize, they split into their ionic components. This is bicarbonate splitting apart into a bicarbonate ion and hydrogen. So an acid breaks apart into its ionic components. An acid in an acidic environment is less likely to ionize. So you put an acid like aspirin in hydrochloric acid, it's going to stick together. It's less likely to break apart, right? That's what that's showing us there. An acid in a basic environment is more likely to ionize. So you put it in a basic environment, it's more likely to break apart, right? Ionize. When it's ionized, these guys are they're charged, right? That it all comes down to the membrane. The membrane repels charged particles. That's why they don't get transported across the membrane. And instead they stay wherever it is they are when they ionize. All right. So, of course, a base has more, I didn't say this earlier with the acid, but an acid has more hydrogen ion than it has hydroxide. A base has more hydroxide, OH, right? Remember, OH, than hydrogen. So here's a couple examples of bases, and when they ionize, this is sodium hydroxide, this is ammonium hydroxide. When they ionize, they break into their ionic components, as you guys know. So this is just the basic components and the hydroxide. It's a kind of a generic formula. So a base in a basic environment, like in a like environment, base in base is less likely to ionize, and you might want to write down here, more likely to be absorbed from wherever it is, wherever that drug is. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen with my finger. I realize you guys can't see that. And it's going to stay like this, which means it would be transported from where it is right there, let's say in the small intestine. and the small intestine should be alkaline, and so that basic drug like morphine will get absorbed potentially into the bloodstream from there because it's in a basic environment. A base in an acidic environment, like the stomach, you put morphine in the stomach, it does not get absorbed there. It's going to ionize in there, and those ionic components would be repelled by the cell membranes that line the walls of the stomach. So, like I said, and this is we have simplified this like grossly. This is grossly oversimplified, but it's okay for our purposes. In a similar environment, drugs are less likely to be ionized. So an acid in an acid environment, a base in a basic environment. In opposite environments, drugs are more ionized, which means they split apart. So an acid in a basic environment will ionize. A base in an acidic environment will ionize. The important thing here, to go back to the big picture, is when something is ionized, it is not as likely to get to its receptor if it has to cross a membrane. It's stuck in the place where it ionizes. So you might be thinking, do I really need to know this? Is this very important to me? In most cases, it's not that important to you. In most cases, in terms of drug development, when they're manufacturing drugs, and if they know they want the drug to absorb in the small intestine, they're not going to make it so it absorbs in the stomach, right? They're going to ionize it in the stomach. You know, and the flip side of that would be if you wanted a drug to get absorbed in the small intestine, you'd need to make sure that the drug is a base. It's a basic drug. However, we do things sometimes to change the environment of our stomachs, like taking a whole bunch of Alka-Seltzer, for example, which would change if you're taking drugs and Alka-Seltzer, that could potentially change what happens with those drugs in the stomach. You know, you could, in terms of the blood, we're not going to be alkalinizing or acidifying our blood because that would kill us way faster than anything else. So that's not really important to us. However, there are some other reasons that we want to talk about this, and I'm going to get into those examples in a bit. So, again, to reiterate, acid drugs and an acidic drug in an acidic environment is less likely to ionize, better likely to be absorbed, to be transported from one place to the other. A basic drug in an alkaline environment or a basic environment is less likely to ionize, more likely to be absorbed. An acidic drug in a basic environment is more likely to ionize, less likely to be absorbed. So instead it's being trapped at wherever it is when it ionizes. A basic drug in an acidic environment is less likely to be absorbed because it is also going to ionize, which means it's trapped in that place where it ionizes. So I think we've covered this, but the question asks, which form of a drug moves through membranes more readily, ionized or not ionized? Hopefully you don't have to think much about that. So when this is just said in a different way, which form of a drug is more likely to move across a membrane? It's going to be a non-ionized form. Non-ionized forms are transportable. Ionized particles are trapped by the membranes. They're repelled by the cell membranes. So here's a reason why we might want to think about this. So sometimes, and this is maybe where some of this knowledge will come in handy. So inside the kidney tubules, the nephrons, the pH varies from somewhere usually in a neighborhood of 4 to 8. That's not a big deal. Of course, you know the pH of the blood does not vary from 4 to 8 because we'd be dead. The pH of the blood is, if you remember, 7.35 to 7.45. That's a very tight range. 4 to 8 won't work in the blood. However, in the nephron, it does work because this is how we get rid of, acids and all kinds of things are happening in there, right? So, as we know, ionizes influences reabsorption. So what's happening in terms of the pH in this nephron will directly influence whether or not a drug that may be in this nephron stays in the nephron and ultimately gets peed out, right? Leaves in the form of urine, or gets reabsorbed back into the blood and takes another trip through the circulatory system. So that's important. Okay, so here is another scenario, right? We talked about the stomach. Stomach is unique because it's so acidic. So aspirin, which is an acidic drug, it remains non-ionized. It does not ionize in the stomach and therefore gets absorbed. Whatever aspirin doesn't get absorbed in the stomach and lands in the small intestine is going to ionize, and absorption will be impeded because the pH of these two locations are very different. The pH of the stomach is somewhere around a 2. The pH of the first part of the small intestine, when we dump a whole boatload of bicarbonate in there, is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 8, right? So that changes how absorption happens. Here's another example of where this might be something we might want to think about. Breast milk is slightly acidic with a pH of 6. Ionization influences the ability of the drug to return to the blood after it enters the milk. So what I'm saying is we can reabsorb the drug if we can influence the pH of the breast milk. Again, there's not a whole lot of utility around doing that, but there is that. This is a very real concern if a mother is taking medications, because the breast milk is one of the ways that we secrete some of this medication. So the baby is very likely to be getting a hefty dose of the medication as well via the breast milk if the mom is breastfeeding. All right, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. I'm going to stop and I'm going to come back and finish this section off with the second video because I don't want the first one to get too long. So when we come back, we're going to talk about factors which modify drugs' effectiveness and drug doses at the receptor. I will see you momentarily.